In the name of the holy and undivided Trinity, one God. Amen. The words witness and testimony seem to mean similar, although not identical things, depending on to whom you talk. In the legal profession, they have a very specific meaning. A witness is someone who has experienced something firsthand and then relates it to others. She or he then provides testimony as to what was seen or heard. It's up to the jury to synthesize the testimonies of all the witnesses and come up with what they believe actually happened in order to determine guilt or innocence. In some religious circles, though, these words mean something a bit different. Providing witness or testimony is a way that people evangelize, telling others the way that Jesus has intervened in their lives. Sometimes this takes the form of a direct divine intervention. The conversion of St. Paul on the road to Damascus that we'll be observing next Sunday is one example. Today's gospel reading is another. John the Baptist testified, "I saw the Spirit descending from heaven like a dove, and it remained on him," him being Jesus. God told John that the one on whom the Spirit descends is the one who baptizes with the Holy Spirit. John saw this occur, so he was able to testify that Jesus was the anointed of God. Today's reading is the first time that we see Jesus in the Gospel of John. Both the legal and religious aspect of witnessing appears in this story. In fact, the whole narrative of Jesus' life in this gospel revolves around the question, who are you? This is from the starting point of Jesus' baptism all the way to when he was standing before Pontius Pilate. John the Baptist says plainly from the outset that Jesus is the Son of God. Bit by bit, we see others testify to this. Andrew, the brother of Simon, was one of the followers of John the Baptist who heard John witness to the identity of Jesus. He and another follower pursued Jesus. Jesus turned around and asked them what they were seeking. Their response was a bit awkward, in my opinion. They replied by addressing Jesus as teacher and asking him where he was staying. Perhaps this is because they didn't know what they were looking for. They only knew that it was something of monumental importance. The principal takeaway from this narrative is that Andrew reacted. He did something. After he heard the testimony of John, he told someone, namely his brother Simon. An eyewitness account, whether in legal proceedings or religious events, carries a great deal of weight. Witnessing in the Gospels affects the ones doing it. Simon is a good example of this transformation. Jesus caused him to be transformed, even giving him a new name to reflect this transformation, namely Peter, or the Rock. We lose the relationship between these two words in English. Although someone after the first service told me we do have Peter and petroglyph as tying these words together. But in French, we see another example, because the word for Peter is pierre, which is also the word for stone or rock. Now, can you imagine Dwayne Johnson wrestling in the WWF under the name Pierre? Neither can I. But Jesus declares that it is upon Peter, the rock, that the church will be founded. This is quite a transformation for a lowly fisherman. John's gospel is different from the three synoptic gospels in that Jesus' identity is disclosed right off to his contemporaries. In the other gospel accounts, Jesus' true nature is revealed gradually over time, or even kept secret for a while. But the writer of John wastes no time, since his claim from the very first line in the gospel is that Jesus has been around since the beginning of time. His time on earth as the incarnate God was only a small slice of his total existence. The witnessing of John the Baptist did not end with his head being placed on a platter at the request of Salome. He is still witnessing to us. A few decades ago, many of us might remember the anagram WWJD. What would Jesus do? It was meant to remind us that Jesus is a model for our daily lives. If we could just live in a manner consistent with the way that Jesus did, then we would grow even closer to God. Roger Nishioka, in an article in Feasting on the Word, would like to propose that we change this anagram to WWJBD. What would John the Baptist do? The reason for this proposal is simple. We are not God, nor can we ever expect to be. We hold before us Jesus as a model of perfection, but he is fully human and fully divine. Now here's the newsflash. We will never be fully divine. Striving for the impossible is an exercise in futility. John the Baptist, though, he was fully human. He's someone we can really use as our guide in our human lives, in spite of wearing animal skins and eating locusts. John the Baptist was the model of a good and faithful witness, and I believe this is a model worth emulating. When we see God in our lives, we ought to feel compelled to witness to this event. Episcopalians often think of themselves as being too polite to trouble people about things that really impact them. The good news, though, does very little good unless it's shared. This is not something to keep secret. Rather, it is something to be shared with others. In part of Paul's letter to the church in Corinth that we read today, he rejoices that the testimony of Christ was strengthened by the Corinthian church. The Corinthians were witnessing to each other and to others, just as John the Baptist was witnessing to Andrew and his other follower, encouraging them to change from becoming his disciples to becoming disciples of the one whose sandal he was unworthy to untie. In 1968, my family lived in Japan. For those of you living during that year, you know what a transformational time it was. It was the year of the Tet Offensive in Vietnam, worldwide student protests, the Chicago Democratic Convention, the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy. There was another assassination that year, that of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. In our supplements to lesser feasts and fasts called Holy Women, Holy Men, and a Great Cloud of Witnesses, we celebrate his ministry on April 4th, since that was the day of his martyrdom. Our secular holiday, however, is celebrated tomorrow, and I can't think of a better modern example of a religious witness than Dr. King. Being in Japan, we were somewhat isolated from the events in the United States, since our only source of news came from the U.S. military radio station and the Stars and Stripes newspaper. We didn't have images on the TV to show us what was really happening during this time. When we heard of Martin Luther King's death, I distinctly remember my mom saying, "I don't know why people are so upset. He really didn't do much." I like to think that my mom is up in heaven chatting with Dr. King, and now she knows all that he did. His impact is still very much being felt today. The reason is that he was a witness, and a prophetic one at that. He saw what God's reign could look like, and he witnessed to that vision. We don't have to become extroverts to become witnesses of what Jesus is doing in our lives. Something must be going on in us, or otherwise we'd all be having brunch on Sunday mornings instead of sitting here in church. Instead of suppressing our thoughts when we think an opportunity to witness is at hand, we ought to go ahead and talk about it. Witnessing is what we are called to do as disciples. Our bishop witnessed by telling those of us at the diocesan convention how Jesus came into her life, and she's encouraging us to tell our stories as well. Very few of us can ever expect to be witnesses at the level of Dr. King or John the Baptist. We can all, however, be witnesses in the way that God has created us as unique individuals. God is transforming us in amazing and wonderful ways. Now is the time to proclaim the good news. It's not the time to keep the great secret. Amen.